Okay, so welcome everybody to today's presentation, Writing Your Preservation Plan. This is a short lunchtime session, so we're just going to be kind of hitting the major points to give you a little context around what needs to happen in your institution to be able to get to the point of writing a preservation plan and executing it. It's going to be a little while in this presentation before we actually get to the writing part. It's a little bit of a bait and switch, but mostly I'll be going over the whole system of things that should be in place to facilitate writing a preservation plan. How are you going to determine the contents of the preservation plan? Having everything in place before you actually put pen to paper. If you do a lot of good investigation planning, the writing part shouldn't be very painful. And it shouldn't take a huge amount of time either. It's really more about doing information gathering, some decision making, and then going ahead and starting to draft. So to begin with, every part of running a preservation program is founded on assessment. I had a conversation yesterday with someone who described this word as a little off-putting or sometimes scary. It's not a test. It's really self-evaluation or evaluation by an expert. We depend on both of these things in the preservation world. And truly, if you're going to be running an organization or a program of any kind, doing regular self-evaluation or regular assessment to, gauge the needs of the program, gauge its success. These are really important things to stay in touch with. So it's no different in preservation. We want to begin with a program of looking around and taking stock of what's actually going on. So at this point, we're trying to determine both the holistic and specific needs for the collection because we are focused on the collection, the objects you hold, whether those are paper, photographs, audiovisual, digital collections. Really, even a historic structure assessment is an incredible part, an incredibly important foundation for doing historic preservation of historic structures and landscapes. So this really starts to become a frequent partner in the road to taking care of objects. It's kind of a program of constant evaluation. So we think about the holistic and the specific needs for the collection. We start by thinking pretty big first, think broadly and programmatically, and then we start to get closer and closer to the objects that we're taking care of. So we want to look at, big, broad collection-wide issues, but then we'll also be looking at things, collection by collection or object by object for what each specific thing means. What's important to know is that if you're in a library or a museum or an archive, preservation is often a core service in the heritage field, which sometimes means we forget to see it. Everyone has separate little preservation tasks that they do within their jobs, but we don't necessarily understand it as a large programmatic effort where all of those tasks add up to a program and there is a discipline of study. So when you start trying to put together and assess what all of those different preservation activities are, is when you can start seeing that program happen again. It's doubtful that there's no preservation happening at your institution, even if you haven't done assessment or preservation planning yet. There's probably a lot of preservation going on everywhere. But evaluation and gap analysis is the time where you can start to connect all the dots and say, this is the stuff that's going on. These are the programs that we have in place. And then start to think, where do we want to be in a few years, which is the concept of the plan itself. So we begin with assessment. Then what we start to do is take that report card kind of that we've written for ourselves. It's an understanding. We start to take the understanding of where the program is, what kind of activities we are engaging in, and then we start to make lists of what we want to improve. You know, in maybe in some case, I'm trying to think of like a good specific example. You have a program where you box historic books, but what's happening is that you're only evaluating them as patrons are bringing them up to you very broken. And so maybe you want to, maybe you want to think, um, what if we had a more systematic way of identifying the items that we wanted to take an intervention with? Like, what if we, on the staff side, rather than on the user side, be proactive about getting high risk objects in boxes? So that's a type of change you might decide to make in your preservation plan, or in your set of actions. And you start to build up a set of actions like that, and then you start to prioritize them. Because always we have limited time and resources, and it's unrealistic, and also sounds kind of crazy to think that you could just do everything all at once. Not every object is of equal importance. Not every activity you can do has equal impact. So you're going to start thinking about this as mitigating risk, because preservation overall is a risk management activity. You've identified through your assessment different kinds of risks, and then you start to put them into priorities for high risk, low risk, and we'll come back to all this throughout this presentation, and think about what activities you want to engage in and start to prioritize them. Some of the questions we ask ourselves are, what will do the most for the least? What would have the largest impact with the least amount of effort? What will have a large impact but will take a lot of effort? What will do some, like a little bit of impact, but it's very easy? And then, is this idea that I have has almost no impact, even though it's easy? Is it worth doing? So those are some of the questions we start to ask ourselves during prioritization. And then we start to pull together, as a part of that prioritization, the resources that you need to make the changes. There's a lot of changes that don't require any increase in staffing or budget. But then there are changes that require maybe moving time from one project to another, or actually fundraising and pulling together new revenue to make something happen. So these are the pieces you're playing with when you're looking at how to put together a plan of action. So like I said at the beginning, we start looking at the program holistically, and try to organize things by big overarching concerns that affect all the collection. And this starts with what we usually call a general preservation assessment. So I'm just going to walk through kind of the big categories that we look at, because I perform these assessments a lot, and this is how I'm going to be looking at an institution. And it can be the same way that you look at your own institution. So collection management is one of our bigger pieces. And when we say collection management, it often encompasses, pretty much everything you do to a collection. But some things that are important to review on a pretty regular basis are all of the policy underpinnings for your collections decision. Your mission statement, while it's not something that would necessarily be frequently revisited, it's good to take a close look at it and ask yourself, does the mission statement support our preservation activities? Or is our mission maybe not describing what we do now? Maybe it is time for a revisit. And then some other collection policies, like collection development policies and selection policies, things like that. What are you bringing in and what are you not bringing in? And is that process working for your users and for your staff? The next big area we look at is staffing and budget. A lot of times people believe that this just means hard numbers, but most of the time you should probably just keep looking at efficiencies. More money is great, but sometimes reassigning staff or updating job descriptions or getting people more training can go further than just infusions of cash. So it's important to see your resource picture as a combination of time that people are able to put into things, um, and the skills that they are bringing to the table, as well as what your revenue and what your expenditures are. I tend to look a lot more closely at how people are spending their time and what kind of obstacles are in their way, so that possibly we can make their jobs easier and help them be more efficient. Because usually people want to be more efficient. They want to be able to get through their work faster, and have bigger impact in their institution. So really listening to staff and being open to their ideas and helping them get training can be just have very, very large impact over time. And then we look a little bit too at intellectual control of your collections. Do you know where things are? Are you able to plan effectively? If you don't know how big your collection is. So some things like that. What kind of data do you have about your collection? Not necessarily, how deeply are all your collections described, or anything like that, but really having a basic understanding of what you have, where it is, and how it's arranged. The next big section is really big. These are the heart. This is really the heart and soul of preservation. These are all the ways that we identify and categorize risk. It's also how we are able to develop activities for protection. And these are things that are determined usually by your structure, the building that you are housed in, or a set of buildings. And also the preservation environment that your building and your spaces are able to provide to your collection. It's very boring, but one of the biggest parts of preservation is keeping up with building maintenance and regular inspection of all building systems. And I want to emphasize that if you're a collections manager, it is not the responsible move to completely contract out this knowledge. You aren't necessarily going to be doing your own building inspection, or repairing your HVAC or your air conditioner yourself. You're not going to be fixing the leaks in the roof, but it really is your responsibility to know when those things are happening and to know the health of your building, because you're a partner with your facility staff and volunteers. You aren't just a client of theirs. So it's important that this is a collaborative relationship and that you both understand how things are happening in your building, and then also the people that take care of your building, if it isn't you, understand that they are directly contributing to the preservation of the collection, because they are. This is really the crux of how to protect objects. So part of your evaluation when you're doing assessment is looking at those building things, the temperature, the relative humidity, the air quality, the exposure to light, the risk of water exposure, the risk of fire exposure, other types of disasters, the risks of pest infestation, and any security risks that your collections face. These are all things that are managed at the structural level. So that's why we group them together. And then here's the part that a lot of people think really is the preservation. Like when we talk about preservation, I think this is what ends up being what a lot of people working in cultural heritage imagine, which is just, handling containers, furniture, folders, and boxes. This is all very important, but it's also more item level specific. So now we're starting to get down into each material type and how it's being housed, and how it's being handled. And handling and poor housing can cause a lot of damage over time. So it is important to review this, but you'll also just be looking for improvements to make that maybe aren't so large scale. You know, a lot of times people would really wish that they could rehouse their entire collection. But sometimes I walk into an institution and there's just kind of like new accessions that sit in a corner without lids for months at a time. And so the kind of intervention that I want to see there is get those particular things on shelves with a lid on them, rather than thinking about let's rehouse all of our photographs in plastic sleeves, which is an incredibly expensive intervention that you know is a good intervention in some cases, but you're going to have to be balancing a lot of these different interventions that you want to make. Um, so those are the major areas. And then we start to look at programs that intersect with preservation in a pretty strong way. And this is kind of going to round out the uh, general preservation assessment. So digitization is a big part, is a program that is not usually understood as a part of preservation, but because it involves one, the creation of a new collection of digital objects, but also two, the physical handling of your collections to actually digitize them. It's a place where you want to do a little bit of preservation assessment. So if you're doing digitization, you want to go and take a look and evaluate what are the workflows, the training and the handling. Are we putting objects at unnecessary risk while we're digitizing? And we could change something about that. And then conservation is another program that intersects strongly with preservation, of course. Conservation is the concept of materials treatment and repair. So this is anything that's not preventative for your object. So you're actually going to work with a qualified conservator to have them repair or stabilize or do some kind of intervention actually on the object. So prioritizing for conservation among your materials and kind of assessing how you are doing conservation within your collection is um, an important part of this evaluation as well. And whether you're able to engage in conservation. A lot of smaller institutions feel like conservation is out of reach. And in some cases that's true, but it's not always true. It's important to remember that even if you put something in a nice box, it's not getting better in the box. It's just not getting worse. So if you have a particular object or a particular use case in which conservation would really benefit the object, it might be worth the reach. But the idea is to do this within the context of this whole programmatic assessment where you're looking at the whole program and all your different interventions together and balance. So before we move on into thinking about prioritizing, I just want to stop for a second and see if anyone has any questions about the areas that I've covered yet. I know it went a little quickly, so I just want to stop and check. Just enter them into the chat box and I'll hold for like a minute. Hey, Olivia, that's a good question. I think a general preservation assessment is a good step in a new archive. It will look a little bit different because you won't have workflows in place already. But it's a framework with which you can look at, what interventions need to happen. It's unlikely that with a brand new archive, all of your objects will be brand new. Um, so they will all need different levels of care. I have worked with brand new archives on assessments in the past. In some ways, it can be in some ways, it's more beneficial than even, doing it a few years down the road because you're able to set up, let's say, like environmental controls and settings and do climate that is very tailored to what you have, rather than dealing with many years of legacy issues. Same with policy development. It's pretty nice to be able to start from a place of very deeply understanding what your collection needs and writing your policy from that, rather than putting something in place that is not really helpful within a couple years. It, but it's the kind of thing that you can do self-assessment with, or you can work with a consultant. I see value in both. But there's also a lot of other things that need to happen in a new archive. So I could see it fitting within the first year or two, but maybe not being the number one task right at the beginning. I would think, as with everything, effective and well managed hiring is usually the best first step in a new organization. I hope that answers that question. And I'll cover a few different other kinds of assessments in just a minute as well, that some of them might sound a little bit more appropriate to your situation right now. So as I said, the next step after assessment is trying to prioritize these activities. So you've looked at your activities and how they are in place. You've sort of evaluated where you are at. It's just kind of a snapshot. And then you go through and you figure out what actions need to be taken in each area. But we don't necessarily treat every collection the same way. We also don't necessarily, believe in every intervention the exact same way. So there's some ways that we try to approach being able to prioritize activities so that we can accomplish things over time and really put our best foot forward in terms of bang for buck. We want to spend our money and our time efficiently and do the best we can from the beginning. So part of that is to really think about priority collection. In certain corners of the cultural heritage sector, or among boards, or in places where parts of your organization where they are not dealing directly with collection management, the idea that you would prioritize some collections over others is scary and sounds horrifying. But it's important to realize that we've already decided some collections are more important than others, because we've lost many collections over the years because they were not kept. So reevaluating your collections, trying to put them into some kind of system of prioritization. It's not a new activity that you're engaging in. It's really just a continuance of acquisition and accessioning. It's a type of appraisal. So these are all very normal activities that you take part in. And reappraisal is an important factor, or is an important task to do as well. So this kind of prioritization is very important, especially for salvage priorities. If everything gets flooded, you don't necessarily have the money to salvage everything. And doing some of this decision making and information gathering ahead of time is going to help you in that kind of situation not make short-term decisions that end up being bad decisions in the long term. So we want to think about how to prioritize collections. One way is the value to your users. This is usually one of the best ways. um, it, you know, archival resources have different ways of having value, and other resources do as well. Generally, archives are mostly understood to have a large evidentiary value. It's really the idea that this is proof of an activity. This is proof that something happened, that a person behaved a certain way, things like that. Artifactual value is important. That's the association. In archives, it's often understood as, an object that either is an exemplar of a certain kind of production, or it was associated with a certain person, a certain movement, a certain place, a certain event, a certain moment in time. The object itself, even if it is a copy of hundreds, has a special value outside of its content. And then thinking research value as well. That's a combination of some of those things. These are all nebulous and they sort of overlap a lot. Working with your users and whoever sort of does your curation is how we get to understand the value of collections. This is where your mission statement really helps you. And if you have a mission statement that is not really all that specific or helpful, you will figure it out quickly when you try to do collections priorities, because your mission won't help you. And collection management policies. It's really, trying to figure out collection by collection or item by item, where does it fit in your overall services and programs. There are some things that we prioritize regardless of their intellectual content because of their format. We need to take preservation intervention quickly, and we may need to spend a lot of money on things in the short term because their format means they will be completely inaccessible very soon, or they may be functionally inaccessible now. And there's always a question of, if your audience cannot access this object, why are you preserving it? So when we think about tapes, magnetic tapes, they have open reel like this one in the center, but also cassettes, VHSs, anything. They are degrading very, very quickly. They are also very difficult to access. It's hard to find machines. The machines often break the tape. So then we risk losing the original object. Some things have been obsolete for quite a long time, such as those wax cylinders. And then some things like this is a reel of film on the right here, like motion picture film, which in its own right is an extremely stable format, but it is very difficult to give access to it in a reasonable way for our patrons. So these are all the things that might play into your prioritization around format. Some of these things you would want to digitize very quickly, even if they might intellectually not be the most important thing happening in your collection. So there are many other types of assessments that you do as you are moving along in your preservation program. They can either follow up on a general preservation assessment, or you can be doing some of them in parallel. They're just kind of different ways that you're going to do evaluations. So we're going to go over them before we get to how to add it all together into a plan. So we have the general preservation assessment. This one we recommend about every 10 years. It's this holistic, big checkup. And you can do this internally, but it does help to work with a consultant. This is often a requirement for preservation grant funding, that you will have had a recent assessment of your program, specifically with an outside expert. So it's the kind of thing that is worthwhile to work with a consultant. They will give you a very nice professional report that you can pull straight from into new grant applications. So this can be a nice, important part of an ongoing program. And there are other types of things. A collection assessment is sort of like a general preservation assessment, but for a really specific part of your overall collection. So you might do this for your rare books, and you would have a qualified conservator come and assess the condition of your rare books and help you determine the priority within that collection for conservation or other kinds of intervention. You might do this, a very popular way of doing this right now is an audiovisual collection assessment, because many of us don't have the expertise to do that kind of assessment internally in our collections. So it really helps to bring in a technician or an archivist or a conservator who has a deep knowledge in all audiovisual formats, and they can help you prioritize within those collections for digitization or other kind of treatment. So this collection assessment is a little bit more focused, and it's very much to help you come up with a plan of action for a specific part of your collection. A security audit or a security evaluation. This is something you can do every few years. You can bring in a consultant for it, or if you have an internal safety officer. It's really just a type of risk assessment for your institution. You'll be looking at the areas of risk for theft and vandalism for your collections. It helps to have this not just be a one-off, but use it as a way to build a culture of security within your institution, so that everyone really has a lot of buy-in in protecting the collections from theft and vandalism. Preservation storage environment is, some of the things I mentioned at the beginning, the temperature, relative humidity, and air quality within your organization or within your storage rooms. This is the kind of evaluation that's really ongoing. You want to be doing data collection, and you can do internal review of the policies and procedures annually around your storage environment. So it does not have to be a thing where you change your set points every other month because you see things going wrong. But you gather data throughout the year and then take a look at it together and make your changes at that point. You can also be working with qualified consultants if it's been a while with your equipment, especially, it can be helpful to work with someone who is familiar with collections, environments, and systems to kind of do an optimization program where they actually do a study of your equipment and make sure that you're getting the performance that you want out of it. So that might be something I would suggest if you've never done it and you do have a big building system. It would be something you'd want to do probably right after a general preservation assessment. But if you've done something like this, or you have a systems engineer you work with pretty frequently, every 5 years or so seems pretty reasonable. And then emergency preparedness, writing a disaster plan. It's, not everybody thinks of this as assessment and planning, but it is, because you're just doing risk assessment in an ongoing manner. So then you do your annual review of policies and procedures around your disaster plan. And this is, also something that you can do just internally, but you can also bring in a consultant to help you with this. So then finally, at long last, we make it to the preservation plan. So now that you've done all of your data gathering, you have all of your interventions that you'd like to make, you'd start to order your priority actions. A lot of your actions can be short-term. Some will be, short-term being within the next year or so. Medium-term, we would call that sort of like 1 to 5 years. And then long-term being kind of like that 10-year period before you get to your next general preservation. For all of your interventions that you've identified, you're going to start to determine the cost for those actions and match them with likely sources of funding. Some things are going to drop off your list at this point because they're just inaccessible, but that's okay. You're going to keep some things on your list that are accessible. And preservation is really iterative and cumulative. So every change you make is a good change. Just because you can't make all your changes doesn't mean that you are failing at preservation. So you're going to look at the cost for your actions and your likely sources of funding. And then you're going to start to map them out over the next few years by urgency and by feasibility. So you'll also want to keep some, some sort of back pocket projects that in case you have unexpected funds or an interested donor, you might have a list of things that aren't on your plan. But if the opportunity arises, you'd like to go ahead and go through with them. So that can always be a nice little thing to have on the side. But mostly you're going to take the things that feel feasible and map them out by urgency. So here's really it. You're going to take actions, resources, and a timeline and turn it into a plan. If this looks a lot like a strategic plan with goals and specific measures of success, that's because it's what it is. A preservation plan is really just a specialized strategic plan for your collections. This is just an example of a way that you could structure a plan. It doesn't have to be exactly like this, but I do like this one because we have areas of activities. So the area here is policy development. There's strategies and steps for increasing the activity in that category. And then there's specific measurements of success. So you'll know that you actually succeeded in that strategy. And then a target date. You could add a column here for budget and maybe prospective source of funding. You could organize this very differently and make just a few areas within the next year that you want to make progress on, or map it out over 5 years and you make a little bit of progress in every area. It really just kind of depends on your capacity, how large your staff is, and what the appetite is for moving forward quickly. But really, any preservation plan is good. I hope that you can see here that it does not have to be extremely robust. You can just be working through kind of a bulleted list, and these things become projects a little bit later with more documentation. But at the beginning, you're not responsible for writing like a 50-page book that is going to guide your entire organization. You just want to start biting off little pieces to chew. So that is basically the overview of writing your preservation plan. So now we have some time set aside for questions. And I should also say, go ahead and visit our website, nedcc.org. There's a whole section that's called free resources, and there are leaflets on preservation planning in there. There's a self-assessment guide. It's a little bit old at this point. I feel like it was published maybe 20 years ago. But honestly, NEDCC has not really changed our approach because it's very stable, and I still find it an extremely useful document. So there's a lot of jumping off points on our website for this kind of stuff. Hi, Mel, great question. I think that either way can work. I think it's very beneficial to start with the general assessment, though, because what happens is that sometimes, like, a board can get driven by a particular event that maybe makes that risk seem larger than it is. We had a couple years ago a very large spike in sort of motivation around security assessments after the Boston Public Library lost track of a print, which in actuality was not a security problem at all. It was a collections management and staffing problem. But it ended up being sort of like a short-term event-based, overly publicized risk that I would argue was a big waste for most organizations that decided to start there. The reason that we just start with the general assessment and make sure to keep coming back to that one on a pretty regular schedule is that when you aren't looking at the entire scope of your program, you can be distracted by things that feel urgent, but maybe aren't urgent, if that makes sense. And in all honesty, that is also why I think with the general assessment specifically, it's very important to bring in an outside expert, bring in a consultant, because the outside perspective can just be very helpful when it's very normal for staff members or people in administration or even people at the paraprofessional level, at every part of the organization to get stuck on something that they feel like is the one stumbling block that's keeping everyone from moving forward. And it can often be just really determined by their specific perspective, and an outsider's perspective is able to sort of untangle a lot of that, and be helpful to, really put some of those feelings in perspective. So that's why I feel like you start with the big assessment, start with the big plan, and then go ahead and drop down into kind of more focused areas once you've figured out where the biggest risks are. Olivia's question. I'm just going to send you straight to the Society of American Archivists website. It's called archivist.org. If it's truly an archive, that's where you're going to find the most broad-ranging advice that you'll need to start up an archive. And there is a lot of information there, but there's a bookstore there as well. And I would definitely look at the monographs. There's a couple really good ones that all archivists start out with. I think literally all of us read them as soon as we start. One is called Arranging and Describing Archives, and the other one is Organizing Information in the Archives. I forget what the other one is called, but there's these two seminal texts, and they are extremely helpful in just knowing what the scope of running an archive is. Preservation is a huge part of it, but there's a lot of other parts. Amanda's question, recommendations on how to find outside consultants. NADCC has a staff of consultants. There are other regional alliances for preservation. You can contact the National Endowment for the Humanities. And while they don't maintain a list, they do have an idea of everyone who's kind of working in the field. So I would, possibly just go ahead and call up the Preservation and Access division at the NEH. So you can go to neh.gov, and they will kind of know what's up there. Yeah, the American Institute for Conservation has a find a conservator option. I have found that conservators are not very good at assessment, but that is my bias. Some of them specialize in them, that's certainly true, but most of them specialize in bench work. Okay, Katie's question. Any tips for getting buy-in from staff? I actually also think a preservation assessment, a general preservation assessment, is an advocacy document if it's done properly. So it can be helpful to have that document written professionally. It mostly is advice for how to move forward with collections, but it is also a piece of advocacy document, or a piece of advocacy. But also advocacy for collections and collections care is just a long-term job. There's no magic bullet for it. You probably want to think about a whole range of ways of doing advocacy internally for the collection, including just, stuff like tours and strategic exhibits and things like that. So don't think of it just as demonstrating need over and over again. You want to demonstrate value over and over and over again, which honestly is the same advice I'd give to you if you were also writing for any kind of grant or any kind of funding. Centering the need of your collection is almost never successful, which is ironic, but centering value and success and potential is the way to really catch people's eye. Recommend small institutions with limited budgets. How should you approach planning? You can do all of these evaluations internally if you cannot bring on a consultant. There are a few grant programs that do support the consultant. So look into the Preservation Assistance Grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities. It comes due in May, so you've got a while on that one. But preservation planning, it is a core, it should be a core activity within an organization. So it's not something that you absolutely need someone outside to do. I would set aside a little time every week. And it's really, it's difficult because you have so many other things going on, but it's important to understand that a plan is what helps you direct all of your other activity in a way that's strategic and efficient over time. So it should be able to help everyone feel like they're on the same page. You may be able to, depending on what your organization is, I worked in other organizations where, well, not worked, I volunteered in other organizations where we had someone on the board who was a skilled facilitator, and they facilitated us through a 3-day strategic planning session. And that was just having everybody in the room and talking through it for a while. And like I said, a preservation plan, I really truly believe it is just a specialized strategic plan. It can even be wrapped into a strategic plan for a collections organization. So that is maybe my best advice on that. I think small organizations in communities often need to rely on volunteer committees for decision making and policy writing. And that does not have to be a bad thing. So an organization I worked with a few years ago was all volunteer, and the collections committee that wrote all the policies was made up of the one of the largest museums in America, their head curator for instruments, a like 300-year-old very successful history museum. Their executive director was on that committee. So, you know, there are skills in your community that you should tap into if you are a small institution. And you know, I could probably talk forever about volunteer recruitment because I've worked both as a volunteer that was recruited and as a volunteer manager. But try to find the skills that you can to fill in gaps like that. So that's we can all, I mean, you're also welcome to, everyone's welcome to email and call if you have other specific questions about preservation planning. Like I said, go ahead and head to our website, nedcc.org, and go to the free resources there. There's a couple monographs. There's the self-assessment guide. And, you know, the other organizations, I'll just type them in here so that you'll have them. There's the Society of American Archivists, which is at archivist.org. There's the, I'm going to write this down because it's hard to remember, the AASLH, which is the Association of American State, the American Association of State and Local Historians, which I believe is just at aaslh.org. And the American Associations of Museums, which I believe is aam.org. And every time I go to those places for help with preservation planning or collections management, they all have sample policies, and they all have bookstores. So, oh, and also the ALA. So go to ala.org too, the American Library Association. Everyone has sample policies you can work from. Everyone has bookstores and free resources, just to keep reading. So that is my best advice. And if no one else has any thoughts or any questions, I'm going to go ahead and close out the meeting. You can feel free to email me or give us a call. There's always someone at the center who can answer your call. And, you know, thank you very much and good luck.